and just cleaning up my studio space after having been up way too late last night, finishing off the motanka, which you can see here. You know, I was talking about relational making, and I had a few more thoughts, especially in the night, about, you know, what is my purpose in sharing some of the practices, some of the ideas behind the practices, the traditions, and some of what it means to be a relational maker, and so on. You know, I mentioned in the previous video that there are no boundaries, and there are no boundaries. I'm not going to go off in a long discourse in physics, but more like let's talk about it from what we can observe in the land. There's no boundaries. The water, the land, the air, all of these natural systems are continuous. They flow from one into the other. Even if you think about a stream or a river in its river bed, the water just doesn't stay confined to that one space. You know, it moves along the walls of the river into the soil, and from the soil into the river. So, you know, or even when you think about air and air spaces into the soil and the spaces between all of the grains of soil, particles of soil. So, you know, these natural spaces, they're continuous and they're reliant on one another and they're supportive of one another. And if you think of that for example, if you think that your house is somehow an isolated system or an isolated place, and that isolated place is somehow safe, or keeps you separate from, where do you think the air inside your house comes from? Or the water, if you have taps, when you turn on the tap. They're not something out there. They are part of your day-to-day life. Think about your clothing and your food. Where does that come from? You're not isolated. So when you think about being, let's say you're having a conversation like I am right now with you, or having a conversation with another person, talking to your fur companions who you might share space with. You know, your conversations are not isolated to the walls inside the room or inside the house. We often get this sort of strange perception that we do exist in an isolated way when we're inside a particular space. But actually your energy field goes beyond the walls. The land is always in conversation with you, even though you may not be aware of the land listening to you. The birds outside, the insects outside, the trees, the plants that surround the space or the building that you're in, they're all in conversation with you. It's just a human-centric idea that has us think that we're isolated, separate from, or can separate ourselves from. We're not. That's just a human-centric point of view. So if you think that you're isolated or somehow separate from events that are happening in Gaza or Sudan or Congo or the United States or elsewhere in Canada, you're in mistaken thinking. Because you're not separate and there are no boundaries. Everything that's happening worldwide, it affects all of us. Not because we choose to let it affect us, because it does affect us. We're all affected, and we're all needing to raise the curtains of our minds that create a veil of separation. I'll tell a little story. So this one time I was walking in the forest, this is several years ago, and I was on Vancouver Island, and I was in one of my most favorite places where I was living there. And the trees were beautiful, big grandmother, grandfather trees. So I walked up to this one tree after, well, background to the story, as I had walked on this very familiar pathway time and time again. This one particular day when I was walking, I noticed that a machine had come through that was cutting down bush and branches alongside the roadway pathway, making way for the hydro wires, which, I understand their reasons for doing that. I don't understand the way in which they do it because it's devastating. It's just complete mayhem, cutting off things almost seemingly at random. Trees completely gnarled and destroyed, and then the next neighbor tree not even touched. And so I was feeling really heartbroken. And as I walked further and further along the pathway and into the forest, I paused, I picked up some of the branches that had been cut down, I put them out alongside a stump, and I kind of made it a little place where I was apologizing on behalf of the humans who had done this in such a thoughtless way. And I went up to one of the big trees and I put my hands on the tree, and I was just feeling that deep sadness and hurt. And the tree was like, this is inconsequential in the lifetime of this forest. This is just a small blip, but it also is another reason why we, the forest, don't trust the humans. And so I was taking that message in, and then I was, if you could say, transported. I was given this vision, not just a vision, it was experiential. I've had this experience of being brought into the soil. And when I was brought into the soil, I could see all of the insects that were moving in the soil, the mycelium that was down there. I could hear actually the movement of worms. It sounds strange, but that was the experience. And then I felt from the tree this message that they don't see us as separate from the forest, though they don't necessarily trust us because we don't act as being one with. We act from a human-centered point of view rather than an ecosystem kind of point of view. And the tree said, "You're one with us, so act from that place." That's a really important lesson for all of us today.